Welcome to the Higher Love with Megan podcast with me, your host, Megan Cooper, a holistic coach and trauma-informed practitioner. This podcast seeks to break out of the echo chamber of societal narratives that perpetuate our institutions and challenge the status quo of wellness and beyond. Join me as we decolonize our minds, address and use our privilege, and prioritize inclusivity. Here, diverse experiences are honoured, and together we are fostering a space that stands for higher love for all. As a listener, you are not just here to passively consume. You're an ambassador for deep healing and societal evolutions, ready to engage in thought-provoking, challenging conversations. As your host, I'm committed to providing ever-expansive spaces that inspire us to contribute to a world defined by higher love. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Well, here we are. So pleased to be having this conversation with you this morning. Thank you so much, Jasmine, for being here.
I really love all the topics that you cover and the types of people that you have on the podcast. So thank you for having me.
Awesome. Well, on that note, actually, I really wanted to ask you first off, because you reached out to me in September, so a couple of months ago, with a view to collaborating for an episode. And I wanted to ask you, what was it that inspired you to reach out, and where did you see yourself within the conversations that I had been having, or where didn't you see yourself in the conversations that I've been having as well?
I think I really wanted to bring in more representation in the wellness world of people living with chronic illness and hidden disabilities. I've faced a lot of barriers as someone working within it as a yoga teacher, and also someone that operates within it as a student or someone who goes to events or like wellness retreat days or whatever. And there's so many things that I see that need to change in terms of accessibility and inclusion. And I'm hoping it's getting more a part of the conversation now, certainly than it was a few years ago, but there's still so much more that needs to be done. And I'm starting to realize that part of helping to bring in that accessibility focus could be sharing my own story. I've often in the past felt like I had to hide it. Certain yoga studios that I've worked at, I felt I had to present a very inauthentic version of who I was to pretend that I was a certain view of wellness, when actually there was all this stuff going on behind the scenes. And I don't want to separate that anymore.
Beautiful. And where did your journey with yoga begin? How did you get into it? How long ago? Yeah, what did that look like?
I was really interested in meditation as a kid. I don't even know especially why. And I'd spend time like meditating with trees even when I was 7 years old.
Wow.
And I remember wanting to design a moon ceremony that I got my mum to do with me when I was 8. And I don't know where it all came from.
Were your parents interested in meditation or ceremonies?
I guess my mum was kind of interested in some like wellness things like that. But I also was kind of super interested in being like designing things, and I found play more comfortable if I was kind of the one designing what we're going to do for the play in school. I like to know what was happening, so it might have been a little bit about that as well.
Wow, amazing. Full-on creative spirit child. Anyway, I interrupted you. Please start from aged 8 moon ceremony.
Yeah, aged 8 moon ceremony. And then I actually got super interested in paganism and like started running a coven when I was 10.
Wow, me and you would have been friends. I love this. Please go on.
And then when I was 15, my mum did take me to my first yoga class. And it was totally different back then. It was in a school hall. It wasn't all these different yoga studios. There was no Lululemon leggings or all that kind of stuff. It was quite chilled. And it was quite interesting because actually one of those first yoga classes that I went to was also when I maybe started to become more aware of there being something wrong with me health-wise. So in one of the yoga classes, I fainted, and I went to the doctors and they just brushed me off and said, oh, it's really normal for teenage girls to faint, don't worry about it. might just be anxiety or whatever. And that was a separate part of the story that goes into all of the health issues and the sort of medical gaslighting that I think a lot of people face. But yoga became, apart from when I fainted in it, that wasn't fun, but apart from that, it became a really good support. I've always kept journals, and I read a really sweet entry from when I was 15 saying that I was super stressed with school, I'd had insomnia, I wasn't sleeping, and then I went to a yoga class. This was someone who was a teacher across the road from me and ran them from her house, which was really nice, and I slept really well that night. And so it was just starting to be introduced to my life as a support for all the different things that I was dealing with. But there was quite a swinging pendulum between this path of well-being and learning to take care of myself, and then this other path of it being really, really normal culturally for everyone my age to be doing drugs and alcohol and binge drinking every weekend. So I was kind of torn between the two paths, or swinging between them. So on a Friday night, I'd listen to a Buddhist meditation CD, do my meditation, and then go out clubbing with my fake ID and get really drunk. And that kind of pendulum swing went on for quite a while through uni as well, until I eventually went sober.
Yeah, wow. I can really see myself in, in different ways, but in that pendulum swing when I first got into yoga, which was in my early 20s. For my first 5 years of practicing yoga, I was very much, going to my 6 a.m. yoga class, but then going out, staying up all night, going back to yoga in the morning, and straddling these kind of two lives until I had to make a decision which one I was going to follow. But just to backtrack slightly, you mentioned around the fainting, aged 15, and that obviously taking you down this journey of what was actually happening with your health. For those listening, just for the context of, at the beginning of the episode, you said that you were chronically ill. What was the fainting about, and what do you experience within your health?
So the fainting could have been related to low iron, because I was living with undiagnosed celiac disease, which is an autoimmune condition.
Yeah.
For anyone that doesn't know, it's where the body attacks itself when you ingest gluten, and the only treatment is to go on a gluten-free diet. Although, and this is a whole other separate thread that I'll come back to later, the wellness world loves to tell you that anything is curable, and that if you do X, Y, and Z, you can reverse autoimmunity and all this stuff, which is categorically not true in the case of celiac disease. But another factor of why I fainted could also be related to my hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a genetic condition. And it's connected to so many other things. You're actually more likely to have EDS if you've got celiac, and vice versa. And you're more likely to have a form of dysautonomia, which is an umbrella term for things like, you might have heard of POTS, post-dural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, which I think a lot of people are getting now with long COVID, unfortunately. And also orthostatic hypotension, which is what I have. So that's a form of dysautonomia, and it means that my blood pressure drops upon standing, which can make me dizzy and make me faint. But I never even got a test for this until a few years ago. So all these years of fainting or getting dizzy upon standing, and I only finally got someone to actually test for the dysautonomia a few years ago.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite I guess a relatively late diagnosis. I know that some people, go for years and years. I mean, even celiac. I know that many, I don't know many, but I know a few people who are celiac who it took them so long to get a diagnosis. So yeah, wow, that's a long time to be, experiencing symptoms of something. You mentioned around the hypermobility, and how does that affect you within movement, or how, up until this point, perhaps without an awareness of it, how was it affecting you within your yoga, within your practice, within movement?
So I actually had a few yoga related injuries, which I probably would assign to the fact that I was practicing a particular version of yoga without an awareness of how to adapt for hypermobility. And this is actually a really big problem that we see, because hypermobile people tend to flock to yoga classes, and it makes sense because we can struggle a lot with exercise, keeping up with peers on group hikes or anything like that. So I felt like I was bad at PE. I grew up thinking I was like bad at exercise. And then I go into a yoga class and it's like, oh, look how bendy you are. Wow. And you get like a round of applause for being able to do this quite extreme posture without having done any training to get there.
Yeah.
And this whole idea of like, oh, well, keep practicing and you can get there for the people that have a different bone structure and maybe can't bend in that way. And there's this idea that there's an aspiration where everyone should be able to bend themselves like a pretzel by the end of doing loads and loads and loads of yoga practice. And that's a super unhelpful narrative. But it was that narrative that I think led me to push myself and not understand the limits of my own body. This is years and years ago now. But with Ashtanga, a lot of the postures in the primary series probably do require like a greater degree of range of movement in the joints than is expected or normal, which is basically what hypermobility is. It's that greater range of motion. And so I was trying to twist myself into like half lotus fold twist and all this, and I didn't realize that that is a really bad idea. But I didn't know I had hypermobility at the time. So and one of the injuries I got was that my sacroiliac joint like moved out of place. And it was absolute agony. And it actually stopped me from doing my yoga teacher training 2 times. So it was 3rd time lucky that I finally got to do the teacher training, because the pain and the injury kept coming back. I finally managed to do it, although I still did have issues. And the celiac disease was also causing problems. I don't know if there was like accidental cross-contamination at the place I was training, because that's really easy to do it in a kitchen if you're not super ultra careful. So I had sorts of issues going on there, and I basically left the teacher training like fainting in a taxi, really sick with a massive fever. But I just pushed myself through 28 days or whatever of intensive Ashtanga training, thinking that that's how you get somewhere. Yeah.
Where did you do your training?
So I did the first training in India, and it was I was thankful that I got to sort of travel around for a couple of months first and learn in different places and go to different schools, and settled down for the first training, which was the 200 hours, which we also know is not, it's a bit wild that you can get certified to be in charge of a whole load of people with all sorts of different needs on a month-long training. So yeah, that's kind of a whole other interesting history as well.
What was it that inspired you to do your teacher training in the first place?
It's a good question. I think even from going to the classes when I was 15, I kind of saw myself doing that in the future. And I think it was about 10 years after my first class that I actually did the first training. It took, and I saved up. I was waitressing to save up for this first teacher training, and then I came back to my hometown after it and kind of spent half the time waitressing and the other half of the time trying to find classes at all different venues across the Northeast. And then continued to save up for other trainings and kept learning. And the more that I did it, the more that I loved it. I also actually find like people and socializing quite challenging, but when I know the role and this like context of what I'm doing, I love being around people. It's quite interesting because something about I love the intention of, you set an intention for the yoga class, you theme the whole class around this intention. You're there to be super present with these people and to pick up in the moment on what people might need, what extra support or cues you can give, and it just makes me so present in a way that I really don't feel in other areas of my life.
I love that. Yeah, it sounds like an environment where actually you can allow yourself to really shine or kind of shine different parts of you into the space. So yeah, sounds beautiful. I just wanted to ask you, as a chronically ill neurodivergent practitioner, how did you experience the training itself, like the 200-hour experience? Were there ways that you felt like it wasn't fully accessible to you, or how did you actually experience the training itself?
I think at that time I didn't actually understand my own access needs. And I was maybe not so in touch with my body as I am now. I think if I did it now, I would have experienced it completely different. But then, I mean, I did struggle. The days are so full on. You wake up at, I can't remember what time, but super early. You do like Ashtanga primary series, which is very dynamic practice. Then you do pranayama, meditation, you've got classes all day, you've got extra trainings in the evening, and there's no way at all that I could attend that now. Not at all. I could probably do a day that's got like 3 classes in it, and one, 2 would have to be restorative. One maybe a little bit more dynamic, but I'd take a lot of adaptations, and I did have to sit out of some of the classes. But I wasn't framing it at that time in terms of access, I think. It just felt like the odd one out. And I've often felt like the odd one out, I think. And there were some other things that started to become apparent to me as well. Like there was a few comments made within the group, the other students that I was with, that were about a horrible incident that happened at a yoga school involving sexual assault of one of the women in the teacher training. And some of the comments that the people who were in my cohort, I guess they were like my colleagues or fellow students, were super victim blamey. And then I was dealing with PTSD at that time, having recovered from something similar, and I suddenly everything just span, and I was like, this isn't a safe space. And I felt like I'd come to the world of wellness to heal, and then suddenly I was thinking, I don't feel safe here, I don't feel safe here. So there's that going on as well. But the teachers were, a lot of the teachers were fantastic, and I learned a lot from them. There's just all these other sort of things bubbling away beneath the surface that made it quite challenging, as well as a beautiful month where it was super transformative and I learned a whole bunch of stuff. So mixed bag.
Yeah, it sounds it. What you've just brought into the conversation, I'd love to bring back in towards the end. I'm just going to make a little Google tab in my head. But I had a question come up, which was what you were just touching on in terms of not being fully aware of perhaps accessibility needs at that point in time. Did you find yourself during your, in inverted commas, like yoga journey, trying to mold yourself into an idea of like what a yogi is or who a yogi is? Did you experience that, trying to mold yourself, or not really?
I think at the beginning, it actually kind of relates to another yoga injury that I had, is that everyone was doing headstands. It was an Ashtanga practice. And headstands is part of that big main sequence that you do. I kind of shouldn't have been doing them because I already had a neck injury from when I was 15, which I now realise is related to the hypermobility. But there was very much a feeling of like, or culture of feel the fear and do it anyway. The magic happens outside of your comfort zone. And I was practicing beside a wall, and there was kind of like I don't know if you'd call it peer pressure, but like, it kind of was a peer pressure to get away from the wall. Feel the fear, do it anyway, expand your comfort zone, believe you can do it, and you can do it. So at home, I got away from the wall, started trying to practice my headstand, felt something like go in my neck, couldn't move, was in absolute agony and was just sobbing on the floor, didn't know what to do. Managed to like reach out for my phone, which was nearby, and ring the brother of a friend who worked in the ambulance services to be like, what should I do? And he said, you need to go to A&E. So I was staying at my mum's at the time, thankfully, and she took me to A&E, and I went there, and I had to sort of wait in the waiting room for however long it was, 6 hours or more. We've got really long wait times here. Get an x-ray, got sent home in a neck brace, even had to pee in a bedpan there before I'd got the x-ray because they didn't know what damage might have been done. Thankfully, it wasn't, it could have been so much worse. It was basically like a soft tissue injury that healed in a few weeks. Trying to do a headstand, because that's what I thought was the aspirational posture to do. If you're a yoga teacher, you've got to be able to do a headstand, like all this stuff that is just actually categorically not true. ended up with me going to A&E and then returning home with a neck brace. It's kind of ridiculous.
Wow. So injuries like that, was that like a turning point for you recognizing these, I guess, barriers to accessibility? Or like when did the lack of accessibility, perhaps, when did that start to really, or how did it start to really reveal itself to you?
I think one thing I'm really glad about is that a lot of the feedback I've got from the beginning of my teacher journey has been that my classes have felt accessible to the students. But I think the area that was a big problem is that it wasn't maybe accessible to me. I wasn't realizing that accessibility includes me as a teacher.
Yeah.
And I think that's a lot to do with internalized ableism as well. Like, it took me a long time to talk about myself as someone who's chronically ill. I think it was actually a very big journey of actually understanding and accepting the limitations that were upon me and the barriers that I face every day. And so I was very understanding of accessibility for other people, but not so much for me, because it would mean admitting how much I struggle.
Yeah, that makes sense. And something that was just coming up for me whilst you were sharing that was, I guess when you said that it took a while, that it was quite a process for you to even identify as someone who is chronically ill. I imagine that there is this, I guess, like challenge within being a wellness practitioner, who at the beginning of the conversation, you said that the wellness industry is like, if you do this, this, and this, then you will be well in every single area type thing. And that's the identity of like, I have to be a fully well person in order to be, fill in the blank, successful within this space or something. But actually what you're saying there around, it was quite a process for you to even identify as being chronically ill. I imagine that how was it you reconciling that someone who is chronically ill within the inverted commas wellness space?
It makes me really angry, the types of things that people say, and really stressed, and it doesn't feel well. The wellness industry doesn't feel well. It feels like it's really sick as a place. Like, I don't even know where to begin with it, but you've got all these wellness grifters selling snake oil and preying upon chronically ill individuals. And they prey upon us because most of us have faced medical gaslighting. We've become like disillusioned with the medical system, even though it's often, we rely upon it as well. And so we're often looking for like alternative ways to support ourselves, but then people jump in and like, they're really good at what they do, and they try and sell you this parasite cleanse for hundreds of dollars, or this thousands of pounds coaching course that's like, yeah, it's the Wild West out there. And once I started realizing that a lot of the people that I maybe used to read ages ago, like Louise Hay, were actually incredibly problematic, it made me find my own inner strength to stand against that really loudly.
How did you find, and this has come up, I know that you listened to the episode that I did with Kerry Jarvis, and she was talking about the problematic arena of the kind of Louise Hay-esque culture of wellness. What did you find problematic within that?
There's so many rabbit holes that I've gone down with it, and it's like the people recommend things to me all the time, and it's actually so annoying. I hate unsolicited advice because obviously I've tried everything under the sun by this point. And I think I used to be really susceptible to it. So the me now is feeling like a mother lion for my past self. Like, I want to like the things that I did in the past, thinking that it would help because of what I was told. Like, I had someone tell me that my celiac disease was because I had a fundamental mistrust in the world, and that I just needed to work on my trust in the world. And I was like, I don't trust you right now. So I feel like I've been susceptible to that kind of manipulative messaging that it's preying upon vulnerable people to make money. And it's not okay. And it's hugely problematic currently as well, when we look at people suffering with long COVID, with ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, and there's so much awful messaging out there within the wellness world that it's a mindset issue, or that you don't believe you can get well and that's why you're sick, and it's horrible.
And I imagine that as a chronically, again, it's like I'm not a chronically ill person, so this is me just projecting my imagination into that space. But I imagine that if you are chronically ill, the yoga industry, or our idea of, what yoga is, as you mentioned, being able to do your handstands, being able to be in a full posture of, all of these poses, that it kind of creates this idea of like, well, that yoga's not available to me because I need to wait until I am, till I can do these things in order to practice yoga. Is that a thing?
Yeah, I mean, even on a very basic level, before all the chronic illness stuff, people will often say to me like, "Oh, I can't touch my toes, so can I come to yoga?" Like,
Yeah.
of course you can come to yoga. You don't have to touch your toes at all. And obviously, everything that I know now with hypermobility, part of me is thinking like, maybe it's a good thing you can't touch your toes. I've always been able to touch my toes. Look at the bother I'm in. Yeah, and also I think that also makes me think of the marketing around yoga. So I'm not a full-time yoga teacher. I run a ethical branding studio where I focus a lot on a values-led way of marketing. And I think the marketing is a big part of the issue within the wellness. And there's loads of stuff like start the day right, come to the 7 a.m. yoga class. You'll come to yoga feeling terrible, you'll leave and all your troubles have gone. Yoga will cure your pain. Yoga will guarantee that you're going to leave in a better mood, all this kind of stuff. And, for anyone that's dealing with depression or PTSD or any sort of mental health challenges, as well as physical health challenges, you might go into a yoga class, leave, you're like, oh, I've still got my chronic pain. I'm still really depressed. Why didn't the yoga fix me? It was sold to me that it was going to make me feel better. And I think we're doing a huge disservice in that kind of marketing. So I really try and not sell anything like that. I like to say that it's a space where you meet yourself where you're at with compassion. And you can come however it is that you are. You're welcome in any way.
Yeah. I'd love to dive a little bit deeper into that, because the way that you're talking about yoga and the way that you hold the space, the way that you invite people into that space sound very different to the way that yoga appears in lots of spaces. So just to ask firstly, like, what do you see as within the industry as like big barriers? And I know that that list is probably quite long, but what would you say are kind of like your big headliners or your like pet peeves, both like on and off the mat? So maybe let's start with the way that, say, yoga is marketed within the online space. What would you say that the biggest bugbears are there?
I think, the idea that yoga's going to turn you into shiny and new, and that you need to improve yourself, that it's a self-improvement tactic rather than a support. And there's a lot we need to do to cope with everything that's going on. It's actually really hard to exist right now. And it's one support that is available to us amongst many other supports. And I don't like the selling of it of like, you absolutely have to do this to be a better person. Like you might love running. You might not even enjoy a yoga class. Running might be your thing. So stick to that. Why not? Like there's many ways to cross a river. And that being said, there's many ways to engage with the yoga practice. It goes far beyond one set style or one type of yoga. It goes far beyond the posture. The way that yoga really shines for me is the relaxation focused elements of it, the rest focused elements. Sometimes I feel like what we need to learn to do before we even jump into all these more dynamic versions of it is to learn to rest first. But that can be hard for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah.
There's
Totally.
a certain, I'm hoping that it's getting better, but there's quite a lot of stereotypes within the yoga world. You type yoga into a hashtag on Instagram and you see a lot of like slim build white women doing super bendy postures, and that's kind of seen as the representation. And so there can be a lot of issues within the industry and how it's marketed online. And the more that we're showing all these postures and as if that's yoga, the more we're giving it a one-dimensional view and not seeing all the vast ways it can create. Well, the whole point of it is to create liberation from suffering for all. So like I would see activism as yoga. And there's the whole 8 limbs of yoga, which is all about how we live our lives. It's a massive philosophy. There's so many different parts to yoga, and I'd love to see it being shared more widely in marketing as all these different parts, not just the super bendy, impressive looking posture.
Yeah. It's really interesting that you brought up the activism side of yoga, because to be honest, that's the first this year, whilst I've been diving much more into these topics, that's the first time that I'd heard that, which I found unbelievable, that actually social justice and yoga were all intertwined. And I don't know about you, but that's not something that I really see online, people talking from that perspective. And I know that, we've mentioned around spiritual bypassing, and I think like that seems to come up quite a lot for me within the yoga space. What would you say that you see, perhaps in that respect in the online yoga space?
I think I see it as there's a lot of selling of yoga or as an individualized practice, as for the self and not going beyond that. For me, yoga's always been a way to take care of myself in order to take care of the whole. They're like in a reciprocal relationship together, my inner world, my outer world. So it's not a form of escapism or an individualized self-care practice just to look after me. It's a twin path. There's the inner work and the outer work, and they go alongside each other. One of the ways that I really started to realize that was when I was taking a trip to Palestine, and I was working in a university there in the West Bank. It was a cultural exchange, so I was doing conversation classes with some of the students at the university, and I was attending loads of different lectures, hearing from tons of people. So there was a Palestinian photojournalist, and he would talk about how he managed to document the danger that put him in, living under occupation, how he managed to get through the checkpoints with his camera SD cards. There was a Palestinian man who had been wrongfully imprisoned. He hadn't done anything wrong, which happens all the time, and he'd gone on hunger strike to get released from prison. Eventually he had been released, and he was talking about his experience of the hunger strike. There was all sorts of different Palestinian activists that were teaching us about how they managed to resist the occupation in different ways, through creativity, through creating their own media, through all sorts of different ways. And as I was there and learning and witnessing a lot of really challenging things, I realized like, oh, if I want to be an activist and come home and share all these stories, because that's the most important thing to do, is to share the reality of the situation on the ground when the media here is so distorted and deliberately biased. I was like, I'm going to burn out really fast if I don't have a way to look after myself. And I knew that I could kind of easily be immobilized by everything about the horror of seeing humans being treated so despicably. And that's when I started having a daily meditation practice, because I was like, this is going to be my little space each morning where I kind of pour into my cup, and then I'm going to act from there. And that's when I started to think a lot about the twin path between inner and outer work. And then I was writing articles, feeding back. The big topic there was education under occupation. So because I was working in the university, I was learning about how do Palestinian students manage to access education under an illegal military occupation, and all the barriers that they face. So, yeah.
Wow, sounds fascinating. A question arises for me, having had the experience of actually spending time in Palestine and learning, educating yourself and being around other people who are living under occupation there. How have you personally found, I know that this has affected me, how have you personally found, I guess, the dissonance that I experience it as between the yoga industry and what's actually happening on the planet? There's a lot of yoga teachers who throughout the last year where we've seen horrific things on social media who've not mentioned it at all, and it's kind of just been business as usual. Whilst for me it feels very dystopian that these two things are happening at the same time. How have you experienced that as somebody who's actually spent time in Palestine?
I think that comes back to the spiritual bypassing as well. I have seen some yoga studios sort of vaguely share a thing about peace or run an event where they're raising money for peace or for children impacted by war. It's very, very vague. It's not pointing out the issue. No one's saying genocide or Gaza or Palestine. And so I'm actually very particular about who I choose to collaborate with, which has basically meant that I don't work at a lot of studios. There's one really good studio that I travel all the way to York to teach at, and people are always really surprised. They're like, why are you going all the way down to York? And I'm like, because I've found a good one. And that can be a rare in this industry. And they were very supportive. They offered to host a class to raise money for my Palestinian friends' family who are forcibly displaced from Gaza. And they were really good about hosting that and supporting that. And it brought me back as well to what Kerry Jarvis was saying in your interview with her about solidarity, not charity. When I was talking about that, I didn't want to frame it as like, oh, we're running a charity fundraiser, because it's not what it is.
We've spoken a little bit to how you see kind of the idea of yoga being kind of marketed online, but I'm curious as well how things that have perhaps happened in classes or spaces that you've actually been in person, where there has been a barrier to accessibility or inclusivity for you, or that space hasn't felt safe, or there have been things that teachers have said, practitioners have said, or something like that, that you're actually, this is something that's happening a lot within classes that excludes you in some kind of way.
I think a big common one can be planning a class with a peak pose and talking about the fullest expression of the pose. This is a modification of the fullest expression of the pose, but you should all be working towards the fullest expression of the pose, in quotes. I would move away from that language completely. I don't have anything, no posture in my classes is on a hierarchy. There's no end goal of a certain version. There's 10 different ways to practice the same posture. There's more than 10. You can do it from the floor, you can do it from a wheelchair, you can do it from a kitchen chair, you can do it from the mat, standing, kneeling. There's so many. You can do it from bed. And so we need to think beyond one version of a posture and accept that everyone's going to have a different way to access that posture. And we can still theme the class with intention and bring everyone together with that same thread. We just practice it slightly differently. Another thing is hot yoga is a massive trend at the minute. It probably has been for a while, but there's a lot of hot yoga studios in Newcastle, and I just can't work there. I can't teach a hot class with the dysautonomia, the low blood pressure upon standing. The heat makes it so much worse. I mean, I would be so prone to fainting in that class. And I also wonder how accessible is hot yoga to other people, like someone going through the menopause who's having hot flashes, or there's so many different people that would struggle in a hot yoga class. That there can be risks of overstretching when we're heating the body up like that. I kind of wonder about the different trends that I see out there as well. That can be creating a barrier.
And what do you try to do differently as a teacher? I mean, we've focused on all the things that are problematic, I guess. What are the ways that you try to create spaces for your students? And you've touched on some things, but yeah, I'd just love to hear about learning from your experiences. How do you try to do things differently?
I think it's so important to celebrate people taking the option that's right for them and give them different options. Not so many options that you're overwhelming their system with choice, but enough options that they feel like they can do the exercise in a way that works for them. I'm also trauma informed, so centering choice, consent, agency in all classes. I've been to classes before where they can do quite intense hands-on assists without asking, and that can definitely be problematic with joints like mine. So,
or also people who don't want to be touched within that space.
Yeah, I mean it's dodgy in all manners to touch someone without asking consent first. And I think as well there can be a thing of saying at the start of a vinyasa class, a vinyasa flow, saying, right, we're going to do the flow. If you get tired, take a child's pose. And loads of people, child's pose is horrifically uncomfortable for them. So, but that's the one option given, and then it's never really mentioned again. So I tried to integrate throughout the whole class the more dynamic option and a more sort of restful option. Or you can also give a strength building option in different ways too. So for example, you can do a handstand lying on your back or even on your belly, where you're engaging all the bits that you might engage in a handstand, but you don't have all that pressure on your wrists. So I think it's also really good to acknowledge that, like, if you're practicing from a bed or a chair, it doesn't have to mean that you're only doing the softer side. You can still be doing a sort of more dynamic version, just in a different way.
Yeah, that makes sense. What would you love to see more of from practitioners within the space? I mean, obviously you've mentioned quite a few things there in terms of like giving options and, you know, really celebrating people taking the path that's best for them. What would you love to see kind of like as an industry, from individual practitioners and as a collective?
I'd love to see everyone having a really clear awareness of their scope of practice. I think we can get into dodgy territory when yoga teachers start acting like doctors or therapists, when of course that's completely beyond their scope of practice. I also think there could be a lot more of a supportive environment around neurodiversity. So stimming can be a really helpful way for people to access the practice who are neurodivergent, but I've seen in classes people say that you've got to be still, or that you can't do the meditation lying down, you've got to do it sitting up. There can be very rigid ways of doing it, whereas we know there's not.
Can you define stimming just for someone that hasn't heard?
Yeah, so it's like repetitive movements or sounds. It could be tapping or like hair twirling or rocking or making a certain sound, and it can help people with ADHD and autism regulate sensory input. And it can allow them to connect to the yoga because they're able to be their authentic selves and do that self-regulation practice. I think I'd actually really love to get like a basket of stim toys and bring them along to some classes. I think that could be really nice. I often say to people like in Shavasana and stuff, obviously you don't have to just lie there on your back in complete stillness. I mean, that could be triggering also for PTSD survivors. It can be distressing for a number of reasons. So you can do Shavasana sitting up, you could do it lying on your side, you could squeeze your hand into little fists and then release, so you're getting that tension and relaxation. Another one is to rub the forefinger pad over the thumb pad, then the thumb pad over the middle finger pad, and do that across the whole hand, so you're getting a little bit of sensory input there. It can also help if you're prone to sort of spiraling in the mind. You're kind of focusing in on a bit of movement and pressure between the fingertips. So there's so many different ways to engage with yoga practice with different needs. Another thing that can be really good for neurodivergent people with if we're trying to focus on like breath awareness could be external stimuli. So if you're lying in Shavasana, maybe putting like a pillow or a bean bag on the belly and then feeling that lift and fall as you breathe in and out. So rather than focusing on the internal sensation, you're feeling the external stimuli.
Yeah. What's really coming through for me just listening to the examples that you're giving is the way that you teach, the way that you would love other people to teach, is really giving people permission to be themselves and to feel safe or find safety within themselves, within the space. And I think certainly classes that I've been in and, you know, yoga as a whole, it kind of says that it's giving people permission to be themselves, but actually it's not, because what you're saying is that a lot of people might go into classes and actually feel really unsafe or feel really not themselves, or like they are trying to fix themselves into what the teacher's telling them to do or how they think they should be. And there's this real difference coming through of like the way that you're speaking about yoga, of giving people just permission to just be within the space in whatever capacity they need, in comparison to this like, okay, be yourself, but also fit into this mold that I'm telling you to fit into. And I can really resonate with so much of what you're saying in terms of like the permissioning, the other suggestions, the other cues, the inviting people to find what feels best for them, and the exploration and curiosity within that. You know, over the last few years, I've done a lot more work with local authorities and the women that attend the workshops that I do there. It's all different types of needs. So there's neurodivergency, there's women with extreme PTSD, agoraphobia, severe anxiety, women who've been through abuse, drug use, criminal justice system, homelessness. So dealing with like a whole range of sometimes quite complex issues. And it hadn't even occurred to me that even things like, okay, sit down and close your eyes is actually really alarming for somebody who's been through severe trauma. Or, you know, even doing a kind of grounding meditation, which for me, I think is relaxing, is really triggering for some people. And it's been such a gift doing that work, because it's made me look at every single word that I say and every single instruction that I give that I just take for granted. It's made me just review everything and really be very mindful in how I express things to people.
Yeah, absolutely. And there can be so many ways to do that sort of initial grounding as well. One way that I like to do it is to get people to look around the room, so they're gently moving their neck, they're scanning their environment, and then I also get them to turn to look at the exit, and it kind of speaks to the part of their system that might be afraid or nervous or fight or flighty. They're like, oh look, there's the exit. I can leave at any point. I'm not stuck here.
Which is crazy actually, because I remember because I used to practice a lot of hot yoga, about this would have been about 15 years ago, and we weren't allowed to leave the room for 90 minutes.
Whoa.
Like they would literally like lock the door.
Whoa.
Which is crazy, like thinking that now compared to what you're saying of like, be aware where the exit is. If you need to go, that's where it is. It's just it's like chalk and cheese, that.
Yeah, actually, I remember a class ages ago where you weren't allowed to drink water because they said it would put out the fire in your belly.
Wow.
I think going back to a question all the way from the beginning as well, in terms of like, when exactly was it that I started to be more aware of accessibility for myself with my own chronic illnesses? I think that the training that I did last year with Accessible Yoga School was a really big part of understanding accessibility for me as a teacher, and it was so cool to be in a training cohort amongst colleagues where I didn't feel like the odd one out at all. There's a real sense of kinship, and it was amazing to see the diversity in the teachers. There's so many different teachers leading so many different modules. There was modules on disability justice, LGBTQ plus inclusion, white supremacy in the wellness industry. We heard from so many different people, and I'm now in the Accessible Yoga Ambassadorship, which is really cool as well. And so I'm getting regular check-ins with this group every month, and that gives me a lot of hope. Like, you see how many people around the world, how many yoga teachers are trying to change the industry.
Yeah. Well, I think I think it's the one thing that gives me like hope that we're going in the right direction, actually connecting with more people who are seeing things for perhaps what we've created so far and are really standing for something different. I just wanted to ask, the module that you just outlined there around white supremacist culture within wellness, because this is something, it's an area that I'm fascinated in and have really been, I guess, awakened to like over the last year, which is unbelievable considering that I've been in the wellness space for the best part of 10 years. How would you say that you see white supremacist culture playing out within yoga?
I think it comes back again, maybe to spiritual bypassing too. There can be within those sort of wellness communities, there can be a lot of white people sort of saying, "Oh, well, I don't see color. We're all one," and obviously that's completely dismissive of the systemic like barriers and discrimination that are embedded within our entire culture. That's a big one. How do you say that? Like an unwillingness to actually look at the issues facing us. And you see that across intersections as well. I've noticed that a lot in terms of LGBTQ plus inclusion. There's a complete unwillingness to engage with any of the issues or barriers. And there can be an idea of like, well, this is the way that I want to do it, and this is the way that I'm going to do it. So, for example, there's been a lot of interesting conversations around saying namaste at the end of a yoga class. Whether or not to say it, and there's people who are from the culture where yoga originates in India who are saying, well, actually that this is not particularly the right context to use it, or there's people saying that they experience it as problematic, and that's, I want to hear about that and learn about that, and I think there can be an unwillingness to look or talk about things that people don't necessarily want to talk about, cultural appropriation, or face the discomfort that we might be partaking in it, even if it's accidentally. And there could be a lot of discomfort around making mistakes. I'll have made so many mistakes when it comes to things like cultural appropriation as a white person myself, and I need to learn about that and be willing to like accept the errors that I might have made.
Yeah, totally. And a question also around LGBTQ, I can never say acronyms. LGBTQ, is that the correct acronym that you just said?
LGBTQ plus.
LGBTQ plus, yes, that's correct. How do you feel like accessibility can be improved in that respect?
I think that again, it can be something that studios don't necessarily want to address. It can be a lot of like gendered language in classes, or there can be assumptions made about sexuality, and there can be I'll use the same term as before, but an unwillingness to look at the barriers and the issues and how people might be partaking in creating those barriers without even realizing. I collaborate with two really good organizations up here in Newcastle, and they bring me in to teach yoga once a month, LGBTQ plus yoga. One of them's LGBTQ plus Northern Social Group. They like fight barriers to social inclusion, and there's one called which is trans and non-binary peer support organization, and I love that community space. It's not in a yoga studio, it's in a community space. It's wheelchair accessible, it's donations based, but there's no pressure to donate, and these are all of the things that are starting to remove barriers. So there's the financial barrier. If you make it donations based or pay what you can, you're hopefully removing a financial barrier. Obviously the wheelchair accessible space, and a teacher who knows how to include wheelchair users within a yoga class, that's hopefully removing some barriers. The neurodiversity affirming aspect, and also the awareness of the issues that LGBTQ plus people face. So can be at higher risk of experiencing mental health issues. But so it's vital that the LGBTQ plus people have these spaces designed that are there to be supportive and affirming of them. A lot of people will say that they don't feel necessarily included or welcome in like a typical yoga studio class, and that comes back to the marketing, the images that are put out there, the wording, and people don't see themselves in the marketing, and it can be really scary to walk into that class and not know, am I actually safe here? Am I going to face some form of discrimination here? And there can be like a lot of hard feelings around rejection because of potentially being rejected by family members after coming out. Yeah, it can be really hard to access these spaces.
Yeah. I'd love to just ask you, because I know this is an area that you're passionate about, how do you think that yoga has the ability to transform lives when it's taught in accessible ways?
Well, I think it's actually really interesting now because there's a lot of like modern day Western science research studies that are now giving like sort of, they'd call it, I guess, evidence-based research that's now saying, oh yeah, so yoga has been shown to help survivors of sexual abuse to heal, or a yoga study has shown that it can improve sleep, or a study on meditation has shown that it can interrupt pain signals. And it's it's catching up with what ancient yogis knew thousands of years ago in India. So it's not like the science now has discovered something new. It's actually just confirming what was already known, kind of in a different context, a modern day context. So I do massively believe in the practices, and particularly in the ways that it works with the nervous system. It helps us to re-find a feeling of safety within the body. And that can be especially important when you have faced lots of different systemic barriers. And there's this whole other piece where the wellness industry is prioritizing profit over people and causing all sorts of issues. But that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the practice itself. It's been distorted by capitalism and commercialization and all this kind of stuff. But the practices themselves are absolutely incredible. And I've seen them support so many different people from so many walks of life. And I think that's beautiful.
Yes, capitalism distorts pretty much everything, doesn't it? So why not yoga as well? Just to start wrapping up, I'd love to ask you, for those who are listening who are practitioners, teachers within the space, but also people who are consumers within the space, people who go to yoga, who attend studios, what would you love to invite the listener into?
I guess it maybe comes back to there's no one size fits all, and to be really open to different ways of doing things. It's so important because we're all going to face different seasons of life. We might break a leg, might have an injury that disables us for the rest of our life, might get a chronic illness, and we're going to need to adapt the way that we do things. And if you absolutely love yoga, you don't have to stop doing it if something like that happens. You can always find a way to continue getting that support of the yoga practices. There's always going to be a way to access them.
Yeah. Beautiful. Was there anything else that you wanted to bring into our conversation today? Anything that you haven't said that you feel like you want to say? Anything that you'd like to share?
I guess that I'd just love to see accessibility embedded into every single teacher training and yoga class. And I think the Accessible Yoga School are doing a really great job. So I definitely recommend checking them out.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you for introducing me to them, because I haven't heard of it before, and I'm so pleased to hear that it exists. So I'm definitely going to be looking that up.
Yay.
How can people connect with you?
I guess I'm quite active on Instagram. I've also got my website, which is jasminesara.co.uk. I'm super open to collaborations for anything really in the future, maybe collaborations for retreats, workshops, offerings. So I'd love anyone to get in touch who might want to collaborate. I do one-to-ones online for people with hypermobility, so that helps them to adapt their yoga practice in hopefully a more safe way. And I'm doing an online workshop on the 18th of November all about yoga for hypermobility, and it's aimed at both yoga teachers who want to learn about it so they can make their group classes more accessible, and for yoga students who have hypermobility and want to know, how can I adapt my practice to suit my body?
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you so much for this conversation. There have been so many amazing things that you've shared that have, really opened my eyes in lots of areas. And I've just found this so interesting. So just thank you so much for connecting, and thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me and for asking questions that invite very interesting reflections.
Thank you for listening. It's great to have you with me on this journey towards higher love for all. Our time is our greatest commodity and gift, so thanks for investing it in yourself and sharing it with me. Please do take a moment to rate and review the show, all of which enables more people to find me and for me to connect with more great guests each week for both yours and my enjoyment. All links, references and contact information is detailed too within the show notes. And I always love to hear your feedback, so feel free to hit me up on my Instagram at higherlove_with_Megan, or via my website, higher-love.com. Send your takeaways, and if you enjoyed this episode, please share or send on to someone else who would benefit. Until next time, big love.